Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today, I am going to show you an important conversation I had with my friend Jordan from Reason to Doubt on February 18th, 2025. This originally aired as a live show on Reason to Doubt. I'm going to link that video down below. Make sure you click over, give Jordan a subscription if you're not already subscribed. I'm recording this in March of 2025, and I give you that information just so people watching in the future have all of the context in terms of when this was going on. This show I did with Jordan was about trans people and how trans people are real, how intersex people are real, how sex isn't a simple binary, and also, more importantly, really, the ongoing campaign to demonize, scapegoat, and really erase trans people from public life that's going on right now in the United States and other parts of the world, like the United Kingdom. So in this conversation, we talked also about how gender-affirming healthcare for trans kids is unquestionably beneficial and saves lives. And we also talked about how this is a textbook smear campaign from the current wannabe fascists in charge of the United States, and how it's necessary for their political project. Fascism requires an other, a them, as opposed to an us, to scapegoat. Trans people are the boogeyman of the month, both as a target to blame problems on, and also as a distraction. So people don't realize that Elon Musk and his insane clown posse currently rampaging through the federal government aren't accomplishing anything except enriching the already disgustingly rich. Recognize what's going on for what it is and don't take the bait. Now, a couple more quick things before we get to the actual video. First, this was a sweary stream because, as you'll see, this makes us angry. Second, we interacted a bit with the live chat during the original show. So you'll see comments pop up on the bottom of the screen from time to time. Those are from the original stream in February. I think we pulled up all of the comments that we mentioned, so there shouldn't be an example of like where we're talking about a comment, but you don't see the original comment on screen. But if that does happen, one of us read the comment out loud and you'll still have the context for it. Third, yes, this is about science and pseudoscience. And it's also political. If that's a problem, if you didn't come to this channel for politics, you know where the door is. But I don't know why you would do that, because everything I do on this channel is political. The ultimate cause here is to push back against Christian nationalism and creeping fascism. Creationism is one arm of Christian nationalism. Creationism is not a scientific project. It is a political project. And finally, I expect everyone to know the rules when it comes to transphobia on this channel. The rules are the zero tolerance policy. Test me. Watch how fast I ban you. With all of that out of the way, thank you for watching. Please enjoy the show.
What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I am Jordan, and today I am joined with Dr. Dan, aka Creation Myths. How's it going, Dan?
It's going great in 2025 adjusted terms.
Yes, okay. If you're going to scale it for 2025,
we're grading on a curve, but things are good.
That's fair. I guess with that caveat, my week has been going pretty well too. I think I'm coming down with a cold, and I probably caught it at the protest I went to on Sunday. So if you're listening to this, get out there, grab your signs, get heard. But speaking of getting heard, today you and I are going to be talking about, well, as a framing device, not really about him, but kind of as like the framing for this conversation. We're going to be talking about Richard Dawkins, the esteemed biologist with credentials out the ears. People in the comments, the post like where I announced this, were extremely offended that I suggested that he was primarily an atheist activist, even though that's what he is now.
That's 100% what, I mean, even that was what he was 20 years ago. Now he's like primarily a crotchety old man who's mostly an anti-trans activist. It's like,
right.
Not even really doing the atheism anymore.
Atheist activist, noticed transphobic bigot, and former biologist Richard Dawkins. We're going to be talking about him. And specifically, what we're going to be talking about are his stance on trans people and sex and how he's conflating the two, and why he's basically wrong about everything, things he should know about, things that are in his field, and things that are outside his field. And in order to do that, I thought we'd bring on someone who is actively actually like in the field for realsies, though, currently.
Currently, occasionally.
Yeah. So Dan, in case somebody isn't familiar with your channel, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan. I'm an evolutionary biologist. My PhD is in molecular genetics and microbiology. I am a full-time teacher of college-level biology. That's what I do. I teach intro bio. I teach evolutionary biology. And last year, I actually co-authored a paper with Dr. Zach Hancock, which is the first time I'd done that in a while, which is cool. And my channel, Creation Myths, is all about the claims of scientific creationism and why they are all nonsense from top to bottom. And I also branch out into having creationist guests on occasionally when they will grace me with their presence, and kind of respond to creationist, videos or articles as I see them and think they're interesting. And that has occasionally led to extended, back and forth conversations with various creationists. So I'm proud to say that many of the major creationist organizations are aware of my presence. They know who I am and what I do, and that makes me very happy.
You've been called out by name several times.
I have been called out by name several times by various professional creation scientists, let's say. Yeah. Which, for my little YouTube channel, I'm happy with
that. Yeah. So if you haven't subscribed to Dan's channel, you definitely should do that. Link is in the description. Dan is probably single-handedly responsible for basically all of the biology I know, which is not very much, but it's all thanks to Dan, since I was a creationist when I was a kid. So my book was exploring creation via subject, physics, biology. I distinctly remember the picture they had of hypothesis and how it eventually would grow into a theory and then a law one day. And it was like a guy jumping over like barriers, like he was like running a track and he'd like jump over barriers, and how creationism. Anyway, that was my book. That's what I learned.
That causes me pain to hear that's not. Oh my God. Okay.
But it's okay. I got better.
Yes.
So we're not going to talk about that today, though. Today, we are talking about Richard Dawkins. Now, Richard Dawkins has done some good things in the past. For example, his book, The Selfish Gene, as Triceratops says, is a very good book. Is well within his area of expertise. My favorite thing about Richard Dawkins is he's the one who coined the word meme. Like,
yeah, it's great.
Like, I think it's pretty funny, actually, that like Richard Dawkins. Yep. Atheist guy is the one who came up with that idea. So, I mean, that's cool. Like, he's done some cool things, but all those cool things were a long time ago. What he does now is far less cool.
Far less. A lot less cool.
So, to kind of introduce the topic, we're going to be talking about some terms. We talk about sex. We're going to be talking about gender. We're going to be talking about trans people. So kind of at the top, I want to clarify that these two are not the same thing. Sex, gender, two separate things. They are correlated, right? If someone is, and we're going to get into what all these mean, but if someone is male biologically, meaning they have the biological machinery that is usually associated with being male for the most part, then they are probably male in terms of their gender.
Right. And just folks, before we go, I just want to point out how hard it was for Jordan to like define that in a concise way, because it's hard to define biologically. We're going to get there, but I just want to put a spotlight on that. It's a hard concept to define biologically.
It's hard if you're trying to speak correctly.
Yes. It's very easy if you're just willing to be wrong. Yeah. Very easy.
Sure. Yeah. So that is true. They are correlated, but they are not definitive. One does not equal the other. I will just point out real quick, because this is a spicy topic, I am all about free speech. I am not about bigotry. So if you're in the chat or in the comments later and you want to ask a question, you disagree, and you want to respectfully voice that disagreement, I encourage that. At the first whiff of transphobia, you will be banhammered into relativistic speeds. Just be aware. Okay. Anyways,
I endorse that moderation policy. You wield that ban hammer with an iron fist. Everybody knows where the line is. If you cross the line, you're gone. Very simple.
right. Okay. Anyways, so that is what we're talking about. So let's enter Richard Dawkins. Here are some things he's said. That is why he's on the thumbnail of this video looking as old and white as possible. He said, quote, "Science, there are two sexes. You could talk about gender if you wish, and that's subjective. I'm not interested in that. As a biologist, there are two sexes, and that's all there is to it." That's the end of the quotation. He has also expressed the summarized view that some men choose to identify as women and some women choose to identify as men. You will be vilified if you deny that they literally are what they identify as. Okay, so these are the statements he's made. And of course, if we're going to examine these statements and talk about trans rights, who better to do it than two cisgendered heterosexual white guys?
There you go.
For some reason, people seem to listen to us more than they listen to the people who actually live this, people. Like actual trans people. But hey, it's okay. I am happy to be the voice, use my privilege to speak on this topic when I can. Okay, so why is Richard Dawkins wrong? I think it makes sense to start with the biology part, and like he's wrong even about that,
right.
And then we can move into the gender part.
Right. Okay. So let's start with a very simple definition, right? Sex. The simplest way to define sex, just like biologically, which is a very complex thing to actually define, but the simplest way to do it is if you are a sexually reproducing species and you have differentiated gametes, which is to say one of the gametes that's involved in fertilization is very big and the other gamete is very small. If you make the big gamete, you're a female. And if you make the little gametes, typically a lot of them, you're a male. That is the simplest, most basic biological definition of sex. Big gametes equals female, little gametes equals male. Now, right away, Jordan, I know you're not a biologist, but right away you could probably spot an obvious problem with this definition when we try to apply it universally to humans and sort every human on Earth into one of those two categories.
Yeah, I currently don't produce small gametes. I've been fixed. I don't do that
anymore.
You
there are a lot of people that don't produce gametes. And here's the thing. Now, if Richard Dawkins or somebody was to be like, but Jordan, you did at one point, you had the capacity to, you just chose to change that. And like, okay, fine. But there are lots of people who at no point in their lives produce gametes or have the ability to produce gametes at any point. So right away, we have exceptions to the binary. And Jordan, we've joked about this before, but what do you call a system that's a binary with exceptions?
Not a binary is actually what that's called.
At that point, we're done. We could just like end this right now and move on to the other stuff about like, so what should we do medically for trans kids, Because at that point, the fact of the matter is sex isn't binary, and we could just call it a night right there. Now, one of the big arguments that you hear in response to this is, well, those are just exceptions, and they're, disorders of sex determination, sexual development, and it's only a very small percent of people. The numbers are inflated. It's actually a fraction of a percent. It doesn't matter. And what I would invite everybody who makes that argument to do is think about this. If there were, instead of, we're still talking about millions of people, right? But if there were, instead of millions of people, if it was in the thousands, the tens of thousands, the 4-digit, just thousands, would it still be okay to have segregation and discrimination against Black people if there were only, say, 10,000 of them in the entire country, world, whatever? Would that be okay? No. Obviously, that's a dumb question, right? Like, obviously. So everyone who's immediately going to go to, but it's only a few people who are actually blah, 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 just stop right there. It could be literally one person. Doesn't matter.
Yep. Because all humans, all of them deserve human rights. It's right there in the name. It's like the first.
It's right there.
First word.
It's human.
Yeah.
It's not cis human. It's not gender matches sex human. It's not produces gametes human. It's human, right? So that was our attempt to use what gametes you make as a definition for sex. And when you do that, you don't get just everyone sorted into two categories, right? It's not a clean, objective binary system. So there are other proposed definitions, and I have heard developmental biologists, for example, say that it's actually XX versus XY. It's chromosomes, not gametes. Do you have, is your karyotype, is it 46XX or is it 46XY, which is to say you have 46 chromosomes with either two X chromosomes or an X and a Y, right? Where XX is typically female, XY is typically male. Well, everyone will be, I'm sure, shocked to learn that there are people who are neither 46XX nor 46XY. For example, shocking that there's the complexity in biology, right? Amazing. Who could have seen that plot twist coming, right? So you could be, for example, 47XXY. That leads to certain intersex conditions, for example, right? You can also have a situation where you're 46XX or 46XY, but your phenotype, your actual physical morphology, doesn't match your chromosomes in terms of what sex typically goes with which set of chromosomes. And there are a bunch of reasons that this could happen. It could be problems detecting male determining hormones, for example. So you have a Y chromosome, but it doesn't have a developmental effect. You could have a translocation where one chromosome, one piece of one chromosome breaks off and attaches to another. That happens between the X and Y chromosomes. So if the part of the Y chromosome that takes an embryo and puts it down the pathway for male development gets attached to an X chromosome, you could be 46XX, but have a male phenotype, have male primary sex characteristics. So you can't just go based on chromosome. That doesn't work. So where do you draw the line then? You can't use gametes. You can't use chromosomes. You can try to do things like levels of hormones in your body or your bloodstream. You could try to do things like fat distribution, muscle distribution, that kind of stuff. But that all gets wishy-washy because while there are typical distributions for your typical male and your typical female, those distributions overlap by a lot. So those metrics alone don't actually tell you which category someone belongs in, right? So trying to define biological sex in humans is pretty darn complicated. And the people who say it is a strict binary, everybody is either male or female, right? And people who should know better, people like Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne is another example. I mean, they're just wrong about the biology. This is just fairly basic biology, that there's complexity in this system. And your chromosomes and your hormones and your morphology, those things, even though for most people, all consistently point in one direction, and we call those directions male or female, they don't always do that. There's lots of intermediate and overlap, and importantly, flexibility over the course of one's life.
Yeah, I think that Zmorph basically summed it up that sex isn't binary, it's bimodal.
Exactly.
So what a bimodal distribution means, and I'm trying to run the chat while I'm doing this. If I'm looking over, that's why, because this chat, I don't know why this kind of thing tends to bring out all the bigots.
That's shocking.
Anyways, so a bimodal distribution has two humps, right? But there's a bunch of overlaps. So most objects in a bimodal distribution are going to fall roughly into two camps, right? And in the case of sex and gender, you can assign it male and female. And so there are only two categories that are named, but you can have a mix where you're more similar to one or the other. You have traits from one or the other. And before the pseudo-statisticians come at me in the comments, I don't mean bimodal in some kind of strict, I have this x-axis labeled. It's a
Right.
way of thinking it. And I can always tell the people who don't actually use statistics in their life, because the people who actually use statistics, I say, oh, it's bimodal. And they're like, oh, okay. They completely understand what I'm talking about. Whereas all the people who don't use statistics, but have heard one thing before. Anyways, that's
Yeah.
what.
Yeah. There's the people who understand it versus the people who use it as a cudgel. And it's very clear who you are in the chat if you make a certain point. We see you. We know exactly what that looks like. The other thing, Jordan, that's really important to emphasize here is that people will say, okay, but what you're describing is different from the topic that you say you're talking about. What you're describing is intersex people. You have overlap in the middle where it's a mix of traits, where it's indeterminate between male and female, or it's a mix of male and female characteristics. And, it's kind of this non-binary, intermediate, intersex kind of condition. But that's different from trans people who say they can change their sex over the course of your life. And folks who think that, let me blow your mind, because I want you for a minute to think about actual situations where somebody might be born with one set of characteristics in terms of their morphology, their phenotype, their hormones, whatever. They might be born with one set, but then when they enter puberty, for one reason or another, the distribution of hormones in their bodies leads to the development of the opposite set of sex characteristics. So you have one set of primary sex characteristics, but then a conflicting set of secondary sex characteristics. And now you have somebody who spent their childhood as, for example, male, and maybe they have partial androgen insensitivity, for example. This is where the body is not responsive to male determining hormones. And maybe that the doses of those hormones that lead to male development embryonically, they were able to detect those. But then as you go through puberty, they're not receptive to the larger doses of male determining hormones that lead to male secondary sex characteristics, things like an Adam's apple, facial hair, etc., right? Well, maybe that person then, who was identifying as male throughout their childhood, maybe they start identifying as non-binary. Or maybe because the ratio of male and female determining hormones is now off going into puberty, maybe they start developing female secondary sex characteristics, and maybe they start identifying in their teenage years as a female. These are biological mechanisms that would cause these changes. And lest you think this is some weird human societal thing, other animals do this all the time, right? There's like fish, for example, where the largest fish in the population is either the only male or the only female. And when that fish dies or leaves the population, one of the other ones changes sex to become that single male or female, right? This is a thing that happens in nature. And here's the thing, folks. We have a lot of machinery from our evolutionary past. Like, the reason we have hiccups is because there's a neural circuit in fish that keeps water pumping over their gills. We don't have gills or the muscles associated with them anymore, but we still have the neurons from it. And sometimes they short circuit, and that's when we get hiccups. So the fact that you have in our evolutionary history, right, there's lineages off there that change sex as just a normal part of how they operate due to hormonal fluctuations during their life. There's no reason to think that other organisms that are related to them wouldn't be susceptible to the same kinds of changes. And that's exactly the kind of thing we see in humans.
Yeah. And so what I hear a lot of times when you try to explain these things, like you point to people with like Klinefelter syndrome with different numbers of chromosomes, or like they have different features, their intersex condition, which again, we understand is distinct from transgender people, but the people who are making this rhetoric lump them together and use the same words together. So that's why we're covering it, but we understand they're distinct. Anyways, what'll happen is they'll say, oh, well, but you can, that's not like an intersex person. That's just a man with this condition. Right. And It is true. If you wished, you could make your definition for male and female so convoluted and complicated and long and detailed that you manage to sort every single human being into one box or another. Some of those definitions would be arbitrary. There would be no like real reason behind them, but you could, if you were sufficiently motivated and had enough time, make a determination if you wanted to. But that would be dumb and stupid and a waste of time. You would be making your definition not useful anymore.
You would be overfitting, right? You would be doing it in the wrong direction, right? And that doesn't reflect the complexity of biology, because bringing this now to gender, right, which is more let's say less biologically determined, right? So gender is the expression socially, societally, how perception, right, internal and external perception of sex. That you can have two people who have the same underlying biology who express that as different genders. You can have two people who have very different underlying biology who express that as the same gender, right? Those things, as you said earlier, Jordan, those things often go together, but not always. And there's sufficient complexity in the system that you can kind of have multiple starting points, get to the same endpoint. You could have the same starting point, get to different endpoints. And if you're going to lump everybody into just box A or box B, you're obscuring all of that actual biological complexity in humans. And it's not like scientific or biologically accurate to sort everybody into those two boxes. There's too much complexity for that.
Yeah. There's no useful way, basically. What you could do instead is just say, okay, well, we've got this definition that works for most people, like 98+% of people. And then sometimes there's exceptions. That's like all you have to say. It's not a big deal. Like,
yeah, just say there are exceptions. Okay, great. And that's cool. No problem. Who does that hurt? Nobody.
Okay, so do you think we've effectively established that sex is not binary in the sense there are two mutually exclusive and collectively exhausted options that everyone will neatly fill into?
I sure hope so.
Okay, then we're going to transition to the second part of the show. Before we do, there was a question from Andrew Cumming. And since we're at a pausing point here, he says, question for Dr. Dan, is it more likely that sequential hermaphroditism is a more ancestral or more derived system in vertebrates?
Man, that's a hard question. So sequential hermaphroditism is when you start as one sex and you change to a different one, a la clownfish. And like in Finding Nemo, for example, right? That movie actually would have ended with Nemo's dad becoming female and mating with Nemo to replenish all the eggs. Sorry for anyone whose childhood I just ruined. Yeah, sorry. That's how that movie would have ended if it was biologically realistic. Would have been a very short movie. But so that's what sequential hermaphrodism is. Start as one sex, convert to another one. Andrew, that is an excellent question. I am not an expert enough in that to know for sure. My inclination would be to think that is a more derived trait in the lineages that do it, but goodness, don't take my word for it on
that. Okay, cool. I did want to point out, I accidentally put Zamor42 in timeout. I was clicking someone else and chat moved under my mouse.
Oh.
So you've been collateral damage. I'm very sorry, Zamor. If you'll come back, I promise it was an accident. I put it in the chat, but if you're still watching, I'm sorry, my bullet went to the left a little bit. It happens. Okay.
There you go. All right.
Anyways, now we're going to transition from sex to gender. And sex is, when we've been talking about this, is the biological things, the things that are specifically done with your genes and all that sort of stuff. Eric Craig says, he's a troll from forever ago. Never mind. And I thought he had something useful to say. Okay, so anyways, yeah, so that's the biological thing. And right. Here's the thing, it's something that we can look at with a microscope, right? Or we can examine in a lab. If that is that complicated, then how much more complicated do you think it might be to have the social construct that evolves around this thing might be,
it's really
right?
Complicated. It's way more complicated.
When we say gender, what we're talking about is the combination of your own self-perceived image and the image that other people have of you and of your label, basically your obligations to society, the sort of expectations that are around you, that whole quilt fabric that humans construct, both internal and external, all of that together is gender. And hopefully you can see just how complicated that's going to get really quick, right? And it's also important to note that some of this nobody else has access to but you. No one in the world has access to my own internal feelings than anyone else, right? Nobody else has access to that, right? So I am the world's leading expert on what's going on inside my brain, right? Okay, Seymour, if you made it back, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to ban you. I'm so sorry. I apologize profusely.
Jordan, unless everybody does have unique and exclusive access to their thoughts, feelings, and perceptions in their own brains. Unless the person we're talking about is a trans kid, in which case Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne know better than they do.
Exactly. Stu Griffin earlier said, choose to identify as, referring to the Dawkins quote from earlier, has the same condescending tone as Romans 1:20 says, like, you're suppressing the truth of your gender in unrighteousness. Like, and it's funny how quickly these atheists use religious language. Like, anyone who's familiar with this channel knows I'm not an anti-theist. I don't have problems with religion in general. I only have problems with the people who are dicks about it. So I'm just going to say this now. If I say religious language or I speak about Christianity, I'm not speaking about every single Christian, every single religious people. If it doesn't apply to you, then I'm not talking to you. Okay. Anyways.
I endorse that view. I endorse that approach.
So we talked about how sex and gender are correlated, right? Yes. But they are not necessarily tied to each other. And that seems like it would have to follow, because sex is not unambiguous in a lot of cases. So especially, at least in those cases, if no other time, then gender would have to be confusing, right? It would have to be complicated.
There has to be at least as much complexity with gender as there is with sex, right?
Right.
That is the baseline level of complexity there can be, but because it's a societal thing, it's a social thing, it's a perception thing, both of yourself and of other people, that necessarily makes it way more complicated.
Right. So, when someone tells you their identity, what they're communicating to you are the things that are going on inside their brain that you don't have access to, right? And so, when you say things like, this is a man identifying as a woman, what you are saying is that they are lying about the thing that only they know. Right?
Exactly.
So let's just I'm going to kind of talk over the sort of things that are happening with this anti-trans rhetoric and why it's happening and the harm it does. To start with, let's just set aside the facts of the matter for a moment. Let's just set aside whether trans people have this experience. Let's set aside biology. Let's set aside all of that. And let's just talk about people. Okay. I am a secular humanist. I think that we should do things that help people and not do things that harm people. Just fundamentally, that's what I think we should do. Right? Transphobic speech and transphobic acts harm people. This is an empirical fact. People who are trans are far and away more likely to commit suicide. They're far and away more likely to report negative health outcomes. They're far and away more likely to report distress and depression than people in similar socioeconomic strata. And when examined, that is because, largely because of the social stigma and the vitriol they receive for being who they are. Right? And so that means when you say things like that, you are hurting someone. You are doing something to harm another human being. So even if all of this other stuff we're going to say is nonsense, that alone should be enough for you to just mind your own effing business. Right? Like,
just let people be.
Just let people be. Don't worry about it. If they're not hurting anybody, then who cares? And just leave it at that, right? So, like, we're going to talk about why it's wrong. We're going to talk about all the other stuff. But fundamentally, before we get there, you're wrong to start with because the things you're doing are hurting people. And that's wrong. Pibble Punk for $5 Thank you very much. Says, it will never make sense why trans folks act like treating people with respect is such a huge imposition. Someone else's gender cannot hurt you. Exactly. I have said this 1,000 times. This is when someone says, hey, my pronouns are she, her, or my pronouns are they, them, or whatever. And you say, you don't look like a she, her. I'm going to call you he. It's exactly the same as if you said, hey, my name's Alex. Yeah, you look more like a Bob to me. So I'm going to call you Bob. But dude, my name's Alex. Like, nah, I decided it's Bob. Like, you're not being intellectual there. You're just being a dick.
You just, yeah. Why are you doing that?
Yeah, so don't do that. Okay. As Eric Craig says, cruelty is the point. Yes, you are absolutely correct. The cruelty is the point. Okay. So Maverick has been throwing in the chat about how I won't answer his hypothetical. He's been towing the line, but has not yet wandered into transphobia.
Put his most recent one, the second most recent one up. I agree. Put that one up because that's a good place to go.
Let people be, but children should not be indoctrinated or offered any treatment until fully developed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
counterpoint, no, that is 100% wrong, and that attitude hurts children.
Right. This attitude hurts children, and here's why. When someone is trans, when someone has this experience, and I'm going to be right now, I'm relaying what has been relayed to me. I don't speak for trans people. I'm just telling you what I've heard from the trans people that I've talked to. So please don't take what I say as gospel. Go to listen to them. But since I don't have one here right now, the way it's been described to me is that they feel like their body is not right. They were born into the wrong body. It doesn't match their own perception of themselves, and that's very distressing. But there are things we can do to alleviate that distress. Things that don't have anything to do with surgery, that don't have anything to do with medicine, as simple as calling them a different name, a name they prefer. As simple as that. As simple as allowing them to dress in a way that better expresses themselves. These things help them. These things make them less likely to kill themselves. They relieve their symptoms of depression. These things help people. Therefore, we should do them. That's as far as the reasoning needs to go, right? And if you wait until they are fully developed, you are causing them harm by refusing to give them care that will help them until some arbitrary line in the sand we've decided later.
Which, by the way, is beyond the point at which some of the things that are distressing them will have irreversibly occurred.
Right.
The point is to address whatever feelings is the problem at the front end so that nothing irreversible happens. And you hear this a lot from the anti-trans healthcare people that, oh, well, I think it's fine for adults, but I don't want kids to do anything irreversible. Here's the thing, folks. What Jordan was just describing is called socially transitioning. Socially transitioning is reversible because it's all behavioral things. It's things like being called by a different name, using different pronouns, dressing differently, right? You can try to, if you have an early teenager, right, an early adolescent who is experiencing gender dysphoria, they can socially try on a different identity, right? Like some people might get really into like emo. Other people might try a different gender identity and see if it fits them and if it like alleviates the symptoms that they are experiencing. And you can do that like flipping a switch, right? You can try one thing, then if it doesn't alleviate the symptoms, you go back to your earlier name. You go back to your earlier gender identity. It's completely reversible. It's harmless. Doesn't hurt anybody.
Right. Now, Maverick, and I'm only using him because he's espousing the kind of viewpoints we hear. This isn't the Maverick show, but he's conveniently being the foil. Yeah. So he says, "Oh, we're not against social transitions.
No.
Those are reversible." Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Maybe you Maverick,
personally might not be, but we, yes, you are.
Yes, we, as in the group that you represent, are absolutely. And I know this for a fact. I know this from my own personal life because I have a child who is non-binary. And I can tell you for a fact that there are people who are transphobic, who are against them socially transitioning into a name and identity that better suits them. Why? No reason, just because.
There are states and school districts that prohibit social transitioning. So don't tell us that, oh, we're okay with social transitioning. No, you're not. It is legally prohibited in certain states and in many school districts in
Right.
the United States. So no, you're not okay with it. Don't lie to
Another
my face.
right.
Like,
So here's
just
another thing.
no. Actually, Jordan, before we move on from that,
Yeah.
let me just go one more thing and say the poster child for all of the anti-trans healthcare arguments right now is the Cass report from the United Kingdom. And in the Cass report, the authors quite egregiously conflate social transitioning with medical interventions such as puberty blockers and hormones and things. We'll get to puberty blockers shortly. They're also reversible. That's not up for debate. We'll get there. But what the authors of that report say, the reason they do that is they say social transitioning is correlated with subsequent interventions, such as puberty blockers or hormones. And they say this to paint a picture of kind of like what Maverick portrayed earlier, Maverick in the chat portrayed earlier, that kids are being pushed into some kind of, gender non-conforming behavior, and then that is the cause of medical interventions where, had they not been pushed into it socially, they would not have done all of that stuff otherwise. There is no attempt to show a causative relationship between those things. They just say this thing happens, and in many cases of this thing, this other thing subsequently happens. But here's the thing with that, folks. Maybe it's the case that most of the kids who are feeling ill at ease with their existing gender as they start to go through puberty, maybe it's the case that they're actually trans. So when they socially transition, then they subsequently take puberty blockers so they don't go through the wrong puberty, right? Like, yeah.
On this point, Pebble Punk, again, $20. Thank you very much. Wait until they're developed is awful. All caps. Tons of trans people like them didn't get to start transitioning until later in life, and they're forever harmed by having lost out on years and years of happiness and acceptance. Aside from all of the other things, the fact that having gone through puberty as a sex that doesn't match your gender also causes changes that are more difficult to reverse. Aside from all of that, you're just making their life worse for no reason. Why? Stop being a dick.
Jordan, I don't know if Maverick is doing this on purpose, but he's hitting all of the notes that I wanted to hit. So put up his most recent comment. Is Dr. Dan that naive? Put up that comment on screen. Is Dr. Dan that naive to not realize that children can be influenced by trends? What if non-trans people end up having puberty blockers and then regret it? So two things with this. One, kids influence each other's behaviors. Peer groups influence each other's behaviors. Therefore, kids are turning trans from their friends does not follow. Okay? Those two things are not the same. And you can't just say, oh, well, kids influence each other's behaviors. And the kids are kind of dumb and they just go with the trend. Therefore, trans kids, that's stupid and belittling to trans people. And again, Maverick, I'm assuming you have never been in the head of a trans person, just like I have never been. But from what I have read and heard, it is very clear that what they're experiencing is an internal, very real feeling. Again, if you ask trans people, this is what they convey, right? Which I recommend you read some of what the trans people have written on this. It's very informative. It is a real feeling that going through the stages of transitioning alleviates that problem. It's very much an internally driven thing. Now, the second, what if non-trans people end up having puberty blockers and then regret it? That's a great question. And you know what the number one demographic for puberty blockers is? Non-trans people, because puberty blockers are primarily prescribed to halt precocious puberty, puberty that starts too early. So you have puberty blockers at age, 8, 9, 10, 11, if somebody starts going through puberty too early, and then when they get to 11, 12, 13, 14, you take them off the puberty blockers.
Right. So as Forrest
and it's totally reversible. So if you regret it, you know what you can do? You can just stop doing it.
Right. Forrest Valkai points out that transphobes love to pretend that most gender-affirming care, which includes puberty blockers, is done for cis people. It's not even for trans people. Gender-affirming care can affirm cis people. You want to hear some gender-affirming care?
Yeah.
Like a toupee is gender-affirming care. It's making a modification. Like, it's very mild, but it's making a modification to your body to affirm your gender.
To affirm your gender. Yes.
Right.
An example of this that is a very striking example, because it came up, and I don't recall the exact circumstances, but I heard it on a podcast that was discussing this thing, where it was somebody saying that children should not get irreversible medical care, gender-affirming care. And somebody said, okay, what if you have a young woman who is in her mid-teens who is not developing as fully as her peers, and she gets surgery for breast implants? Are you okay with that? And the guy was like, yeah, sure, that's fine, whatever. Okay, that's gender-affirming care. That is gender-affirming care right there. The difference is that's gender-affirming care for cis people, and that we're okay with. Irreversible surgical intervention, we're okay with that as long as it's cis people. Once it's trans people, then it becomes a problem.
Right. Now, Dr. Dan, what if the people who have false transitions, what if they outweigh the number of real transitions? Now, my response to this is, first of all, yeah, what if unicorns showed up? What if?
Okay,
what if? But it's okay, because we have data for this. This isn't hypothetical. We have data. So let's war game this. Let's imagine that your worst nightmares are coming through, that all of these kids are transing their friends, and they were like, you know what? It's super popular, even though I get bullied all the time and I'm constantly ostracized by people who are dicks to me, and the entire world is telling me that I'm a horrible human being who's a threat to the American way of life.
And an inherent threat to other children.
Right. But it's okay. I'm going to pretend to be trans so I can win at sports or something. But regardless, let's say that's right. Okay. What would you expect to follow from that? You would expect that into the future, they would regret what happened.
Regret rates.
And they would seek to reverse what happened. Now, does that happen? Yes. There are some percentage of people who are transitioned to some degree and end up regretting it. You know what other medical procedure has a regret rate? Knee surgery, hip surgery, heart surgery, appendicitis, everything. Every procedure has a regret rate. And you know what all of those regret rates are? Smaller than the regret rate for trans people.
No, other way around. Trans people have a smaller regret rate.
That's what I meant. There are fewer trans people who regret doing it than there are people who got their knee replaced. But you don't hear people screaming about knee replacements.
No, we shouldn't do any knee replacements, Jordan, because the regret rate is 7% or whatever it is. Yeah, the regret rate for medical interventions for trans people is in the low single digits. It's extraordinarily low.
It's even worse than that, because if you dig into the data on those regret rates, you know what is the number one cause of regret? It is people being dicks to them about it. The number one cause of regret for transitioning is that people have faced social consequences from people being mean to them and people bullying them and people, all of this sort of stuff, right? And therefore they give up and they decide to be miserable as a gender that doesn't match their as a perceived sex that doesn't match their gender. You know what I mean? So they choose to detransition, even though they don't want to, because it's better than being constantly demeaned by everyone
their
around
community. Them. Yeah, exactly. It's so you have people who, for internalized reasons, right? They experience gender dysphoria and they begin to transition. They go through some level of transition, and then within their community, they're bullied and ostracized, and they're miserable. And so they detransition is the word that you hear. And that happens, again, in a minuscule fraction of cases. And the reasons for the detransitioning are not that, oh, actually, I didn't have gender dysphoria. I was happier, more content, felt more at ease with myself as my assigned gender at birth. It's socially, this is not a feasible thing for me to do in my community. So I need to, that's the majority of that very small percentage. So the actual number of people who go through some degree of transition and then regret that based on what is essentially a subsequent gender dysphoria, right? It gets worse rather than better. That number is minuscule. It's probably a fraction of a percent of all people who go through some level of transition. And by the standard imposed by the anti-trans activists on this, by the standard that they want in terms of regret rates, literally no medical interventions would be allowed ever. But that's not actually the argument they want to apply. They don't want to apply that standard because this is not about setting a new standard, a very high standard for medical interventions. This is about being cruel to trans people because they don't like trans people. Like, let's just be clear about what this is. This
Right.
is
100%.
like all this stuff. These are bad faith rationalizations to make excuses for bigotry. They're not actual good faith arguments that these people are making. And we need to be clear about that.
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. Now, another talking about a bad faith hypothetical. I've heard this one, Maverick, our good friend, said it, but also other people in my life have said it. Well, Dr. Dan, what about all those people who are who are identifying as cats and they're bringing in litter boxes and blah, blah, blah. First of all, go fuck yourself. Like, no, they're not.
Like,
it's bullshit.
Yes.
Like, we all know it's bullshit. No person has ever brought up that example and meant it. Every single person who says it knows it's bullshit. And if you tell me otherwise, you're a liar. So that's just we're just going to start there.
But I got nothing to add to. No, that's it. That's the response to that argument. It's that's made up. It's not happening. Period. The end.
But let's just go with you for a second. Let's say hypothetically that there were kids who were actually felt like they had this sort of thing, right? What could we do? Well, the right thing to do then would be to work with their doctor, with their therapist, with their psychologist, and decide what the best treatment was for this species dysphoria. And if the best treatment was to call them a cat and use cat pronouns, then by fucking God, that's what we should do.
Just do it.
Because it would help them. Oh my God, how hard is it to just help people? It doesn't hurt you at all.
It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't hurt you. And if it makes you uncomfortable, you know what you can do? Nothing. You can just say nothing.
Right. I remember distinctly. So when I was a conservative Christian, I was taught to be transphobic. I was joking at Chris. There's not cat pronouns. I was joking. But I was raised to be transphobic. And when I deconverted, I deconstructed a lot of the things that I've been raised to believe. And I was kind of wrestling with the trans thing for a while. And then I realized, I was driving to work one day and it just struck me, just like out of the blue. I was like, wait a minute. This doesn't affect me in any way whatsoever. I guess it's none of my fucking business then. Yeah.
And we're good.
And that's it. That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
But we do know that it works. And so here's the juice. Here's what we should be doing. We have professionals whose entire job it is to treat their patients, whose entire job it is to help people through these kind of issues, psychological issues, for all sorts of things like that. They are doctors, they are psychologists, they are therapists. All of these things are a great thing for a doctor, a therapist, a psychologist, a treatment team to talk about with the parents and the kid. That is who should be involved in this conversation, and literally no one else.
Jordan, you don't think like a board of education, school administrators, state legislatures, you don't think they should be involved? I think they should be involved in this decision making. I think they should have a say.
They should be involved only to the extent which the medical community has said, hey, here's the best treatment plan. Work your school to facilitate that. And that's it. That's all you have to do.
And let's talk about what those treatment plans are, because this is conveniently, we have data on this.
Before you get to that, this is perfect. Hold on. Maverick says, so if a doctor says we should put fur and whiskers on a child to make them more cat-like to alleviate their symptoms, you would support it. Yes. Oh my fucking God, yes.
Because if that makes the kids X% less likely to commit suicide, X% less frequent depression, yada yada, all the way down the line. Yes. Who does that hurt? Who does that hurt?
All of these transitions we're talking about have a measurable effect on a trans person's life. What it does is it increases the quality of their life. They feel better. They are happier. They are more fulfilled. They have a better life because of these very simple things, because they are allowed to do things and then people leave them the F alone. That is all they are asking for. And so if you are going to tell me this is a bullshit hypothetical, you know it's bullshit. I know it's bullshit. But even in your bullshit hypothetical, if you are telling me that by putting whiskers on a kid, we could make them less likely to kill themselves, make them happier, make them more fulfilled, make them more productive members of society, then what kind of monster would say you can't do that? What kind of nosy bastard would say, no, you have to live your life the way that makes me feel comfortable because my feelings are more important than yours? A selfish bastard would say that, and that is literally the only reason you would say it. So if you believe that, then you're a dick, and that's all there is to it. Anyways, this is I'm done dealing with that motherfucker. Okay.
I agree. I co-sign. I agree. Like, and we're going to go through right here because I pulled up some, references for this. I gathered some data for this, so we can talk about like what the data say. Now, it's important here to note that because this is a relatively new kind of type of treatment, right? We haven't been like trying to figure out how best to address gender dysphoria in minors for all that many decades. So do we have as much data as we would want? No. But the data that we have are quite unambiguous in terms of the benefits. So let me just take a minute here, and I'm going to do this kind of using the CAS report that I mentioned earlier as my foil here, because the way they represent these data is hilariously wrong, infuriatingly wrong. So they basically they cherry pick a lot of studies that they include or exclude based on whether they're high quality or low quality in terms of like the degree of certainty they can assign to it. But the standards that they use are somewhat idiosyncratic. So for part of their part of that report, for example, the highest quality study in their data set was a case study with a sample size of 1, which not the best thing to be doing like robust statistics on. But then they're downplaying other studies that have, double-digit sample sizes, right?
Not a scientist, but I think your sample size ideally should be greater than 1. I feel strongly that that's the case.
Probably better, yeah. So they also like just misrepresent a lot of studies in that report. So for example, they cite a study that found traditional like psychological therapy was beneficial in trans kids. It alleviated some of like the depression, anxiety. It alleviated some of the negative aspects of what those kids were experiencing. And that's was presented as like, therefore, we should just do traditional therapy. What they omitted from that same study is that the same study also looked at the effects of traditional therapy plus puberty blockers and found that the effect of the combined intervention was of a greater benefit than therapy alone. But you will not find that in the report. But delaying the puberty that exacerbates the gender dysphoria, turns out, that's even better than just working with a therapist through the problems, right? You wouldn't hear that in the report, but that's what the data say. Very straightforward. There was a group of 3 studies of puberty blockers, which, again, I want to be clear about this. Puberty blockers are reversible. That's the point. That's how they are used in most cases. Most uses of puberty blockers are in cis people to delay early puberty, not to prevent it entirely. You just delay it.
It is a puberty blocker, not a puberty get rid of her.
Right. It's a stop, and then you can remove the stop, and then it goes again. So 3 studies found a mix of benefits and no statistically significant differences across various dimensions of well-being among trans youth, right? Puberty blockers led to a mix across these studies of varying sample sizes of benefits to nothing. None of them found harm, right? In terms of depression, anxiety, this, that, the other thing, right? None of them found harm. There was 3 studies, mix. This was like if you read the studies, the quote is small to moderate improvement or no change. And that was characterized as inconsistent findings in the CAS report. Inconsistent. It was either no change or improvement. And that was inconsistent. We don't know if it helps the kids. It's inconsistent. We don't know. Then there was going to hormones, which is a more permanent intervention, right? Because with hormone therapy, what you're doing is you're actually inducing the puberty of your choice. Right. So now that is a permanent medical intervention, right? Once you go through puberty, you can't ungo through puberty. So what about hormones? What do we want to give like hormones to teenagers that are at odds with their sex assigned at birth? And that's a legit question. How does that affect those individuals? Well, we can characterize those. So I'm just going to read through the list of findings across several studies here. Improved well-being, lower dissatisfaction with body image, lower depressive symptoms, less recent depression, and less need for treatment for depression, lower anxiety and lower need for treatment for anxiety, lower suicidality score, less likely to have seriously considered or attempted suicide, and less need for treatment for self-harm and suicidality, lower gender dysphoria. Those are the findings associated with hormone therapy for trans kids. Those are all benefits. Those are all basically life got better. That's what the findings say.
There's more than one of them, so it's kind of mixed, though. So it's kind of mixed, you know. Who can say? Who can say?
Who can say? Yeah, it's. Oh, by the way, in the CAS report, all of those findings that I just read, the characterization in the CAS report was, quote, insufficient to draw clear conclusions.
So,
like, I don't know, folks. It sure sounds like all the data we have points towards what we would broadly call gender-affirming care, right? Treating the gender dysphoria as a real phenomenon and not trying to essentially do like conversion therapy out of it, leads to significant increases across lots of different metrics for children who are experiencing gender dysphoria. Like, again, I would love to have more data on this. Trans people would love to have more data on this, right? We want more data on this. But, you know, we're not just doing like, let's just randomly give 1 million kids hormones in a 1 million person double-blind study, right? You can't do that. Right. So you work with the sample sizes you have. Many of these clinics, like one of the clinics treats like 7 kids per year. Like, it's just not a lot of people. So it takes time to build up the robust data set. But we're getting there, and right now it is extremely unambiguous.
Right. And again, this is not a problem for you to figure out. This is not a problem for me to figure out. That's not a problem for anyone in the chat to figure out, unless someone in the chat happens to be a psychologist or therapist who's treating trans people or a trans person themselves. This is a problem for them and their patients to figure out, and they will figure it out over time. As Forrest Valkai says, the key words here is if a doctor says, biomedical and psychological sciences aren't intuitive, evidence-based practices don't have to conform to your cisgendered comfort. Doesn't come into it. It's not relevant.
There you go.
Okay, but speaking of cisgendered people, if the fact that these transphobic talking points, of this transphobic rhetoric, this demonization of less than 1% of people who aren't hurting anyone at all, if the fact that you espousing these views is going to harm other human beings and you just don't care because they're trans and that makes them less than human to you, if that is your position, well then have I got bad news for you, because transphobic nonsense has and always will also harm cisgendered people, specifically cisgendered women, because the point of this is not about trans people. It is about control. It is about inflicting cruelty on other people. That is the point. It is about subjugating marginalized people, and that is all it is about. And you can see a clear example of how this kind of rhetoric will harm cisgendered women, because it already has. If you look back at the last Olympics, there were 2 women who fought. They were boxers, right? Richard Dawkins, among a vast sea of other people, called these women men pretending to be women, accused them of infiltrating the sport, demonized the one who won for saying that they were a man who was like attacking a woman. And regardless of what you think about trans people in sports, and if you want my opinion, I don't give a single shit about who throws balls the goodest. I don't care. So stop being a dick to trans people. But regardless, neither of those people involved were trans. They were both cisgendered women. But because one of them looked more masculine than Richard Dawkins thought they should, they get demonized along with everyone else, because that is the point. It is about inflicting their control on other people. And so if you don't care about trans people, perhaps you care about cisgendered women. And if you care about cisgendered women, then you should also oppose this rhetoric, because this is who it hurts. How many women have been chased out of bathrooms because they look too manly and therefore they're not allowed in? Right?
It's a real thing that's been happening.
It is a real thing that is really happening to real people. And so at the end of all of this, We've been talking for an hour. We've talked about how Richard Dawkins is wrong on the biology, how sex is not a strict binary. We've been talking about how sex does not equal gender. We've been talking about how gender has mental components that you don't have access to. We're talking about how these treatments, regardless of how you feel about them, help other people. At the end of all this, the only thing that matters is helping human beings. That's the only thing that matters. And if you want to help human beings, then you need to stop being a transphobic dick and mind your own business. Because these interventions help trans people and they harm no one. And now I'm banning that dick.
Yep, no, he's gone. He just lying. He's gone. Yeah.
Okay.
You can't just keep saying the transphobic talking points and expect people to keep excusing it. If you keep saying the things that are clearly false, then you're gone.
Right.
Like you can't say that traditional psychotherapy is the best treatment when we have direct data that it's not. Like that's just wrong. You can't just say it's.
So, if that was unclear, if anyone is not sure where this channel stands, I can also tell you that the only thing you have to lose is your chains, that workers should seize the means of production, that billionaires are a parasite that are coming after you and your family, that Elon Musk would sell you and your children for a dime if he thought it would help support his bottom line. Anything else you want to ascribe from that?
Yeah. No, Jordan, you're just supposed to stick to the science. You're not supposed to get political on this channel, remember?
Well, here's the thing about that. Is everything is political. Science itself is political. It has to be. And the reason it has to be is because fascists won't let it not be. Because people like Maverick and the people like him will force their politics onto everyone around them. That is why we cannot tolerate the intolerant and why Nazis can get fucked.
Agree.
Anyways.
Hard agree. Hard agree.
I think like, we've made all the points we need to make. That's our show.
Let me just say real quick to just kind of follow this thread just one step further here, right? The way fascists stay in power is by creating an other to scare people with and to marginalize, right? And right now, the other that we are witnessing being created and has been created in real time is trans people and immigrants from South and Central America. Like right now, those are the demographic groups that have the bullseye on them, right? What do you think is going to happen if somehow the Stephen Millers in the Trump administration get their way and manage to put all of those people in camps and deport them or whatever? Do you think they're just going to be like, okay, we're good now? No, they're going to find other people to target. They're not just going to stop, because if there isn't somebody to scare everyone else with, the whole facade falls apart. The whole thing crumbles. There's always going to be a them to demonize.
Exactly.
That's all this project is.
If you don't happen to be the them today, just wait. I love this comic. Hopefully the chat can see it. This is specifically aiming at the section of the gay community that are anti-trans. And it's got the person like, hey, we did it. We got rid of all the trans people. Who's next? Guess who's next? You are. Because fascism always eats their own.
Yep.
Licking their boots is not going to save you. If you remember that poem that we all learned in school, first they came for the trade unionists, and I said nothing, for I was not a trade unionist. Well, today, first they came for the trans people, and I said nothing because I was not trans. First they came for the immigrant, and I said nothing for I was not an immigrant, ... Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Well, I say screw that. First they came for the trans people, and I said, hell no, absolutely not. Get wrecked.
Exactly.
So, Forrest, thank you very much. Be more like Forrest and subscribe to our channels if you want to hear more content like this. Speaking of content, Dan, what do you have coming up?
Oh, I got a bunch of fun stuff coming up. Jordan, thank you for asking. Tomorrow, for those of you who don't know me, my weekly schedule is Wednesdays at 9 p.m. I got a video premiering or a live show every week, Wednesday at 9 p.m. I say that optimistically. I've been going for over a year. I've keeping that schedule. We're going to keep it rolling. So tomorrow, I have my response to Dr. Rob Carter, because we've been having a conversation. Me and Rob have been chatting, via video, and about mitochondrial Eve and substitution rates and mutation rates and all that fun stuff. And he released a video specifically about me, and then released another video on the same topic. So I have my response to him tomorrow going up. I'm really excited about that, because I've been spoiling the punchline to everybody who asks about this. Rob Carter agrees with me. He agrees with me on the important issue here. We agree, and he disagrees with the implication, but we agree on the biology that's happening, and that's what I care about. So then after that, the following week, I'm going to rebroadcast my debate from earlier this year with Dr. Jerry Bergman about common ancestry and common design. And then I have some follow-ups, because that debate has led to not one, not two, but so far 3. I'm hearing them called technical articles, but I think blog post is a better descriptor. 3 blog posts from Dr. Bergman addressing things that I brought up during the debate that he did not address during the debate. So I will be talking about those at some point. I also have, I haven't had time to record a lot of this stuff yet, but I will soon. The really fun one I have coming up that I'm looking forward to is we're going to talk about why post-flood hyperspeciation can't work. So how do you go from your global flood and 2 of each thing get off the ark 4,400 years ago? And then by the time you get to Middle Kingdom Egypt, like 2,000 years ago, all the species are already there. Like you've already got your lions and tigers and cats and everything. That's too fast. You can't do that. So that one I'm looking forward to. That's at various stages of working on it. So I've got a bunch of stuff coming down the pipeline. The Carter thing, that's tomorrow. I'm really excited for. That's tomorrow as we record this on February 18th.
Awesome. I just want to point out, so they were mentioning Forrest, and Forrest also, if you don't know, has an amazing channel. You should definitely subscribe to his channel too. Pillowpunk says that Erica, we are the Science Friends collectively, and Erica hangs out with these guys. I would like to issue a correction. We hang out with Erica. She's clearly the coolest one of the bunch, and she is kind enough to allow us to bask in her presence.
We all hang out together. We all hang out together. We all hang out together.
Okay, so for this channel, coming up in 2 weeks, I should have. I found a apologetics channel. It's about the size of this one, and he has a PhD in theology, so he's like qualified, right? But he does a hold on, sorry, Master Maverick, Dodge Band. Sorry, hang on, sorry, and there we go. Okay,
look, you gotta mute the trolls. You can't.
So,
you just
2 weeks from now, I found this channel, and he has a series of apologetics for teens, apologetics for babies, and I thought it would be fun to kind of go through that and do that, because this is a skepticism channel. We talk about everything related to skepticism. We also, in the future, will have, I need to finish my Shroud of Turin series. I said less Shroud of Turin. I did not say none, so you'll get more of that. I don't have a problem. I can stop anytime I want.
I'm encouraging this behavior. I love the Shroud of Turin content. I think it's fantastic. I learn about all this crazy physics fan fiction. It's just, I love hearing about what the new thing is going to be. I think it's great.
Physics fan fiction is the best way to describe it. So please subscribe to the channel if you're interested in more of that. Hit the like, feed the algorithm. But until next time, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.